Veteran Arthur Corrigan returned home to find peace, but a terrible storm changed everything. The storm had felled his family's ancient oak tree, leaving a gaping pit in the garden. While Arthur saw only loss, his loyal dog Radar discovered something else. He relentlessly barked and scratched at a corner of the pit, where a strange metal object was exposed from beneath the roots. It was a secret cellar door, buried for decades beneath the earth. Arthur thought he was simply exploring an old family relic, but he did not know that opening that door would unleash the ghosts of the past and expose a horrific truth. The peace he had searched for was about to be shattered. The secret lay right beneath his feet. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence was the thing Arthur Corrigan had come to Maine for. It was a deep, resonant silence, woven from the sigh of wind through pine trees and the distant, rhythmic crash of the Atlantic against the rocky shore. After 15 years in the Marine Corps, where the world had been a constant barrage of noise, the shriek of engines, the crack of gunfire, the shouting of orders, the quiet of this inherited plot of land was the only medicine that seemed to work. Here, the ghosts of Afghanistan and Iraq grew faint, their voices muffled by the sheer, calming weight of the New England wilderness. His home was an old, two-story wooden house that had belonged to his grandfather. Its paint was faded to a pale gray, and the shingles were curled with age, but it was sturdy, built to withstand the coastal gales. It stood on a bluff, a solitary sentinel overlooking the sea, connected to the nearest town by a long, winding gravel road. It was a place to be forgotten, and for Arthur, that was the entire point. He was a man in his early 40s, though the hardships of his past had carved a few extra years into his face. He was tall and lean, with the wiry strength that came from a life of disciplined hardship. His brown hair was kept short, a habit from the service, and was threaded with silver at the temples. A short, thick beard and mustache covered a firm jaw, softening the rugged lines of his face, but not hiding the kindness in his tired blue eyes. His daily uniform consisted of a simple gray t-shirt, a worn plaid flannel shirt left unbuttoned, faded denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed but solid work boots. He moved with a quiet purpose, his body still carrying the rigid posture of a soldier, even in the calm of his self-imposed exile. His only constant companion was Radar. The dog was a 6-year-old German shepherd, a magnificent animal with a thick coat of sable gray that faded to patches of white on his chest and paws. Radar was not a military working dog, but he had the same regal bearing and quiet intelligence. Arthur had found him at a local shelter 2 years ago, a nervous, abandoned creature who had flinched at every sudden sound. Arthur saw a reflection of himself in the dog's wary eyes, and a bond was formed on the spot. Now, Radar was the anchor that kept Arthur tethered to the present. He was a calm, watchful soul, deeply attuned to his master's moods. He seemed to know when the memories were closing in, and on those days he would rest his heavy head on Arthur's knee, a silent, unwavering presence that chased the shadows away. On this particular afternoon in late September, a familiar peace had settled over the property. Arthur sat on the porch steps, sipping a cup of black coffee, while Radar lay at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the weathered wood. The sky, however, was a bruised purple-gray, and the air had grown heavy and still. A storm was coming, the kind of storm that Maine sailors told stories about. By nightfall, the world had dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. The house groaned under the assault of the gale, and the windows rattled in their frames. Rain lashed down in horizontal sheets, and the sound was like 1,000 drums beating at once. Arthur sat in the dark living room, the power long gone, watching the trees outside bend and sway like terrified dancers. Each crash of thunder sent a jolt through his system, a familiar echo of explosions from a lifetime ago. His hands clenched, and his breathing grew shallow. He was no longer in Maine. He was back in the desert, the air thick with sand and the smell of cordite. A wet nose nudged his hand. Arthur looked down. Radar had moved from his spot by the cold fireplace and was now sitting beside him, whining softly. The dog pushed his head under Arthur's hand, demanding contact. Arthur took a shaky breath and began to stroke the dog's thick fur, his fingers sinking into the comforting warmth. Radar's presence was a lifeline. He was real. He was here. He was safe. Together, they rode out the storm, a man and his dog against the fury of the night. The dawn broke on a scene of devastation. The world was washed clean, but broken. When Arthur stepped outside, the air was cool and sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The ground was littered with fallen branches and debris. The fence on the north side of the property had been flattened. But the sight that made Arthur's heart ache was the old oak tree. It had stood in the center of the garden for as long of a time as anyone could remember, a giant, sprawling landmark that had been a silent witness to his family's history. Now, it was gone. The storm had ripped it from the earth, and it lay on its side like a fallen giant, its massive root system exposed to the sky. The pit it left behind was a raw, gaping wound in the earth. "Well, boy," Arthur said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Looks like we've got some work to do." He and Radar walked slowly across the sodden lawn to inspect the damage. Arthur placed a hand on the tree's fractured trunk, feeling a profound sense of loss. This tree had been a part of the landscape of his life, a constant, and now it was just another memory. While Arthur was lost in his thoughts, Radar's attention was elsewhere. The dog ignored the splintered branches and the general chaos. Instead, he jumped eagerly into the muddy pit left by the roots. He began to sniff intently at a particular spot, hidden behind a thick, gnarled section of the root ball. He let out a low whine, then a sharp, excited bark. He began to dig, his powerful front paws sending clumps of dark, wet earth flying. "Hey, what is it?" Arthur called out, assuming Radar had cornered a rabbit or some other small creature seeking shelter. "Leave it, boy!" But Radar ignored the command. His digging became more frantic, his barks more insistent. Arthur had never seen him act this way. He trusted this dog's instincts more than he trusted his own most days. With a sigh, he slid down into the pit to see what had captured his companion's attention. He pushed aside a heavy, tangled mass of roots, the soil clinging to them in thick clumps. And then he saw it. Tucked beneath the main part of the root ball, something man-made was glinting in the pale morning light. It was a corner of rusted, brown metal. His curiosity piqued, Arthur used both hands to heave a larger section of the root away. More of the object was revealed. It was a flat, metal surface, rectangular in shape, with a large wheel-like valve handle in the center. It was a hatch, a cellar door. It had been buried here, deep beneath the ancient oak, for who knows how many years. It was a secret the earth had kept, a secret only revealed by the storm's violent rage. Arthur stared at it, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He looked at Radar, who was now sitting patiently, wagging his tail as if to say, "See, I told you something was here." A shiver that had nothing to do with the morning chill ran down Arthur's spine. He knelt, his fingers brushing away the damp soil from the cold metal handle. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed for himself was about to be broken. The metal of the wheel valve was cold and unyielding beneath Arthur's hand. He wrapped both palms around it, braced his feet in the slick mud, and pulled. Nothing happened. The mechanism was frozen solid, fused by decades of rust and the immense pressure of the earth. He tried again, grunting with the effort, the muscles in his back and shoulders straining until they burned. The wheel did not budge a single millimeter. It was as if it were welded to the hatch. Radar, sensing his master's frustration, let out a low whine and nudged his hand with a wet nose. "It's all right, boy," Arthur panted, stepping back. "Just a little stubborn." He knew brute force alone wouldn't work. This was a problem that required tools and strategy, a familiar concept from his former life. He climbed out of the pit and walked with purpose toward the old barn that served as his workshop. Inside, a world of order contrasted sharply with the chaos in the garden. Tools hung in neat outlines on the walls. His workbench was clean, and the air smelled of sawdust and oil. It was his sanctuary, the one place where he could impose a clear and logical order on the world. He grabbed a heavy-duty pry bar, a small sledgehammer, and a can of penetrating oil before heading back to the pit. For the next hour, Arthur waged a methodical war against time and rust. He soaked the valve mechanism with oil, letting it seep into the corroded threads. He used the hammer to strike the casing, hoping to break the seal of the rust with sharp vibrations. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed across the quiet, storm-damaged landscape. Then, he wedged the tip of the pry bar into the spokes of the wheel, using it as a lever to gain more torque. Radar watched the whole process with unwavering attention, his head cocked, his ears perked at every sound. Slowly, painfully, something began to give. A deep groan, like the sound of a great beast stirring from a long slumber, came from the mechanism. Arthur put all his weight into the pry bar, his knuckles white. The groan turned into a high-pitched shriek of protesting metal, and the wheel began to turn. It moved in agonizingly small increments, fighting him every inch of the way, but it was moving. When the lock was finally disengaged, the hatch itself was another challenge. It was a solid slab of steel, incredibly heavy. He managed to get his fingertips under the edge and lift it just enough to prop it open with the end of the pry bar. With a final Herculean effort, he lifted the door and swung it open, letting it fall back against the muddy earth with a heavy thud. A wave of cold, stale air washed over him from the dark opening. It smelled of damp concrete, mildew, and something else, the dry, papery scent of undisturbed time. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, revealing a steep flight of concrete steps leading straight down. "Stay here," he commanded Radar, his voice quiet but firm. He did not know what was down there, and he would not risk his friend's safety. Radar whined but obeyed, sitting attentively at the edge of the pit as Arthur began his descent. Each step seemed to take him further into the past. The air grew colder, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He reached the bottom and swept the beam of his flashlight around. He was in a small, rectangular room with bare concrete walls. It was a fallout shelter, built during the paranoid years of the Cold War. Against one wall was a simple wooden desk and chair, both covered in a thick layer of gray dust. On the desk sat an old, heavy-looking shortwave radio set. A few empty shelves lined the opposite wall. It was a stark, functional space, a time capsule from an era of fear. His flashlight beam fell on something on the floor, tucked away under the desk. It was an old military ammunition box, made of olive-drab metal with faded yellow stenciling on the side. It was out of place, even in a fallout shelter. Arthur knelt and pulled it out. It was heavy. He wiped the dust from the latches and clicked them open. A rubber seal ran along the inside of the lid, and it was still intact. Whoever had packed this box had intended for its contents to survive. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old yellowed cloth, was a single object, a leather-bound journal. Arthur carried the box to the desk, wiping the surface clean with his sleeve. He sat down in the creaking wooden chair, the flashlight providing the only illumination in the cold, dark room. He lifted the journal out.
It was simple and unadorned, the dark brown leather worn smooth with time. He opened it to the first page.
The handwriting was neat and disciplined, a script he recognized instantly from the few letters he had from his childhood. It was his grandfather's, John Corrigan. He began to read. The first several entries were exactly what he expected. Notes about the weather, the price of lumber, repairs to the house, a fishing trip in the summer of 1961. It was the simple chronicle of a simple life. But as he turned the pages, the tone began to change. The entries grew shorter, more guarded. Then he found a section where his grandfather had begun writing about a project. There were no specifics, just vague references. He wrote about his partners, but only with initials. There was V, whose engineering skills were essential. And there was C, whose impatience was becoming a problem. Arthur felt a knot forming in his stomach. He read on, his focus intense. His grandfather wrote about securing their investment and the importance of absolute secrecy. He mentioned the construction of the shelter not as a defense against foreign enemies, but as a place to keep their work safe. The simple farmer Arthur remembered was fading, replaced by a man involved in something complex and clandestine. Then came the entries that truly unsettled him. The confident tone was replaced by one of anxiety, bordering on fear. John Corrigan wrote about loose ends, about the risk of discovery, about the weight of the secret they all carried. One entry, dated from the winter of 1963, stood out. The work is done, but the silence feels heavier than before. C believes we are secure, but I am not so sure. A secret is a debt, and I fear this one will one day come due for our families. Arthur closed the journal, his hand trembling slightly. The air in the bunker felt heavy, suffocating. He had known his grandfather as a pillar of strength, a quiet, honorable man who had taught him how to fish and how to be decent. The man in these pages was a stranger, a man burdened by a secret so great he felt the need to bury it beneath an oak tree. Arthur had come to this house to escape his own past. He had never imagined he would end up unearthing his grandfather's. The 3 days that followed the discovery were heavy with a strange new tension. The physical work of clearing the fallen oak tree was a welcome distraction, a simple, honest labor that tired his body and quieted his mind. But in the moments of rest, in the deep silence of the evenings, the journal's words would return to him. Arthur found himself rereading the cryptic passages over and over, trying to decipher the anxieties of a man he thought he knew. The bunker remained a dark, open wound in the garden, a place he avoided looking at directly. He had covered the entrance with a heavy tarp, but it did little to cover the truth of its existence. His hard-won peace had been fractured, and the quiet he had once cherished now felt filled with unanswered questions. Radar was his shadow, sticking closer than ever. The dog seemed to sense the disquiet in his master, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the home they shared. He would rest his head on Arthur's knee for long periods, his amber eyes full of a deep, knowing sympathy. The simple, physical presence of the dog was a comfort, a reminder that not everything in his world had changed. It was on the 4th morning that the outside world intruded. Radar heard it first. He was lying on the porch, dozing in a patch of pale sunlight, when his head shot up, his ears swiveling like small satellites. A low rumble, faint but growing steadily louder, disturbed the morning calm. He stood, a low growl vibrating in his deep chest, and moved to stand at the top of the porch steps, his body rigid and alert. Arthur came out of the house, a half-empty coffee mug in his hand. "What is it, boy?" He followed the dog's intense gaze down the long gravel lane. A clean, dark blue sedan was making its way steadily toward the house, a starkly modern shape against the wild rustic landscape. Visitors were a rarity. Unannounced visitors were unheard of. Arthur's posture stiffened, the old instincts of a soldier on watch kicking in. He placed a hand on Radar's back, a silent command for the dog to hold his ground. The car pulled to a stop a respectful distance from the house. The engine cut, and for a moment the silence rushed back in, now charged with anticipation. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was around 30 years old, with a practical, intelligent air about her. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and a pair of simple, silver-rimmed glasses sat on her nose. She was dressed for the country, in sturdy hiking boots, dark trousers, and a warm, forest green jacket. She held a leather satchel in one hand and stood for a moment, taking in the house, the storm damage, and the man and dog watching her from the porch. Her gaze was direct and assessing, not unkind, but clearly focused. She began to walk toward them, her steps confident on the uneven ground. Radar's growl deepened, but he did not move, his eyes locked on the approaching stranger. "Arthur Corrigan?" she asked when she was a few yards away. Her voice was clear and steady. "Who's asking?" Arthur's tone was flat, unwelcoming. "My name is Isla Vance," she said, stopping at the base of the steps. She did not seem intimidated by his cold reception, or by the large, growling dog at his side. "I'm a historical researcher. I believe our grandfathers knew each other." The name Vance struck Arthur like a physical blow. V, the engineer from his grandfather's journal. He tightened his grip on Radar's back, his mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. "I don't know anything about that," he said, his voice hard. "My grandfather was a farmer." He kept to himself. "I understand why you might think that," Isla replied patiently. "For a long time, I thought the same thing about my grandfather. He was an engineer, mostly worked on government contracts. But when he passed away, he left behind a box of old papers. I only recently began to sort through them. That's when I found your grandfather's name. And this." She opened her satchel and carefully pulled out a large yellowed photograph protected by a plastic sleeve. She held it up. The image was faded, but the subjects were clear. 3 young men, standing in front of this very house, squinting in the sun. They looked proud, full of the easy confidence of youth. One of them was unmistakably a younger version of the man Arthur knew from old family albums, John Corrigan. "That's my grandfather, Elias Vance, on the left," Isla said, pointing. "The man on the right is William Croft, and in the middle, that's your grandfather, John." Arthur stared at the photograph, his defenses beginning to crumble. The initials from the journal burned in his mind. V and C, Vance and Croft. It was real. All of it. "The papers my grandfather left mention a partnership between the 3 of them," Isla continued, seeing the shift in his expression. "And a private agreement they all signed back in 1961. An agreement that contains a very specific clause. It's set to expire in less than a month from today." She had his full attention now. He finally looked away from the photograph and met her eyes. "What kind of agreement?" "I don't know all the details," she admitted. "The language is very vague. But it concerns a shared asset, something they secured together, something located on this property. The agreement states that upon its expiration, the rights to this asset would be divided equally among their legal heirs. That's us, Mr. Corrigan. You, me, and whoever the heir to the Croft family is." Arthur was silent for a long time. The pieces were clicking into place with a terrifying speed. The secret project, the partnership, the bunker, built not for a war, but for a purpose far more personal. He had wanted to believe the journal was just the paranoid rambling of an old man. But the woman standing before him, with her photograph and her story of an expiring contract, was undeniable proof. A secret was a debt, his grandfather had written, and it seemed the bill had finally come due.
He looked from Isla's earnest face to the tarp covering the hole in his garden, the dark secret that the storm had unearthed. His desire for a quiet, solitary life was at war with a sudden, burning need to know the truth. He could send this woman away, tell her she was mistaken, and go back to pretending. But he knew it would be a lie. The questions would fester, and the silence he had once loved would become a prison. He took a slow breath, the cool morning air doing little to calm the turmoil inside him. Radar, sensing the change in his master, finally fell silent, though his body remained tense and watchful. "You'd better come inside," Arthur said, his voice low and resigned.
He turned and walked into the house, leaving the door open behind him. It was not a warm invitation, but it was an acceptance. A temporary, wary alliance had just been formed. The air inside Arthur's small kitchen was thick with the ghosts of the past. John Corrigan's journal lay open on the simple wooden table, its spidery script a testament to a long-buried secret. Beside it, Isla had spread out her own collection of documents, faded letters, a brittle map of the property, and a copy of the cryptic partnership agreement. The photograph of the three young men sat in the center of it all, a silent trio whose youthful ambition had set these events in motion 60 years ago. Arthur leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, a deep frown etched between his brows. He had reluctantly shown Isla the journal, recognizing that withholding it was pointless. Every word she read, every connection she made, only confirmed the truth he was struggling to accept. Radar lay by the back door, his body seemingly relaxed, but his eyes were open, tracking Isla's every small movement. He had accepted her presence inside the house, but he had not yet accepted her as a friend. His loyalty was singular. "The language is deliberately vague," Isla murmured, her finger tracing a line in the agreement. "The shared asset, the joint enterprise. They were clearly hiding something, and they were careful not to name it. But this deadline, it's real. It's a legal tripwire." Before Arthur could respond, Radar's head lifted from his paws. A low, guttural growl, deeper and more menacing than any sound Arthur had heard him make before, rumbled in his chest. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, the fur along his spine bristling. "Someone's here," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low command. He moved past the table, his hand instinctively going to rest on Radar's head. He looked out the kitchen window and saw it. A large black SUV, the kind that belonged on city streets, was crunching its way up his gravel lane. It parked behind Isla's sedan, its tinted windows reflecting the grim gray sky. It was an arrogant, invasive presence. Two doors opened. A man emerged from the driver's side, and another from the passenger's. They were big men, dressed in simple black jackets and jeans, their faces hard and impassive. They were the kind of men who were paid to be silent and intimidating. Then the rear door opened, and a third man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, tall and impeccably dressed. He wore a tailored charcoal gray overcoat over a dark suit, and his polished leather shoes were utterly impractical for the muddy ground. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his face was a mask of cold, patrician arrogance. His eyes, small and sharp, swept over the property with a look of disdainful ownership. He moved with the smooth, predatory confidence of a man who was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. This was not a visitor. This was an invader. "Stay inside," Arthur said to Isla, his voice leaving no room for argument. He opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, Radar at his side. A silent gray and white shadow of contained fury. The well-dressed man and his two companions walked toward the house, their progress unhurried. They stopped at the foot of the porch steps, the two large men fanning out slightly behind their leader. "Arthur Corrigan," the man said. It was not a question. His voice was smooth, but with an undercurrent of steel. "My name is Julian Croft. I believe you're squatting on my property." The name Croft landed like a stone in the pit of Arthur's stomach. See, the impatient one. "This land has been in my family for 100 years," Arthur replied, his voice level, his body a rigid line of defiance. "You've got the wrong house." Julian smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that held no warmth. "Oh, I don't think so. My family has been a silent partner in this little venture for a very long time. We've been patient. We've been watching, waiting for the right time. But a storm tends to stir things up, doesn't it? It knocks over old trees, exposes things that were meant to stay buried, and it brings unexpected guests." He flicked his eyes toward Isla's sedan. "It seems the deadline has made everyone a little anxious to collect." His words confirmed it. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a calculated move. "Whatever business our grandfathers had is in the past," Arthur said. "The past is never past, Mr. Corrigan. It's an investment, and my family's investment is about to mature," Julian said, his voice losing its polished edge and taking on a demanding hardness. "Now, I'm tired of waiting. You're going to step aside and let my associates and me have a look at the asset. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way." He gave a slight nod, and the two men behind him started to move forward, their intentions clear. They didn't make it to the first step. With a speed that was terrifying, Radar launched himself from Arthur's side to the edge of the porch. He didn't bark. The sound he made was far more frightening, a deep, visceral snarl that was the pure sound of imminent violence. His lips peeled back to reveal a full set of sharp, white teeth. His body was coiled like a spring, every muscle tensed and ready to attack. He was no longer a companion. He was a weapon. The two large men froze instantly. They were professionals, used to dealing with threats. But the silent, lethal promise in the dog's stance was something they had not anticipated. They exchanged a brief, uncertain glance. A German shepherd of that size and temperament was not a problem. It was a serious, flesh-tearing liability. Julian Croft's arrogant smile faltered for the first time. He stared at the dog, a flicker of genuine anger and surprise in his cold eyes. He had come here expecting to intimidate a reclusive old soldier, not to face a trained guardian. He quickly regained his composure, pulling his expensive coat tighter around himself. "A dog," he scoffed, though the sound was hollow. "You think a dog is going to stop me?" He took a step back, a clear signal to his men to stand down for now. He locked eyes with Arthur, his expression turning venomous. "This changes nothing. You can't hide in this shack forever. I know more about what's buried here than you or your little historian friend can possibly imagine. It belongs to the Crofts. It has always belonged to the Crofts," he spat. "I'll be back, and when I return, I won't be so polite. Enjoy your dog while you still can." With a final contemptuous glare, he turned and strode back to the SUV, his men following close behind. The doors slammed shut, the engine roared to life, and the vehicle reversed down the lane, leaving deep ruts in the gravel. Arthur stood on the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the SUV was out of sight. He let out a long, slow breath and rested his hand on Radar's head. The dog's body was still tense, but the terrible snarl had subsided to a low growl. The back door creaked open, and Isla stepped out, her face pale. The mystery of the journal was no longer an academic exercise. The confrontation had made it terrifyingly real. They weren't just piecing together the past. They were in a battle for it, and they had just met their enemy. The silence that fell after Julian Croft's SUV disappeared was heavier and more oppressive than any quiet Arthur had known before. The threat was no longer a ghost from the past. It had a name, a face, and the cold, arrogant eyes of a predator. He stood on the porch for a long time, his hand resting on Radar's head. the rhythmic rise and fall of the dog's breathing, a small steady anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Isla came to stand beside him, her arms wrapped around herself as if against a sudden chill. Her face, which had been alight with the thrill of historical discovery, was now pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know it would be like this. I thought we were just dealing with an old legal document." "He knew you were here," Arthur said, his gaze still fixed on the empty lane. "And he knew about the storm. He said his family had been watching this place." The thought sent a cold dread through him. The isolation he had cultivated as a shield had also made him vulnerable, a solitary target under a patient, unseen watch. He was a soldier, trained to recognize threats, and he had been completely blind to this one. They went back inside, the unexamined documents on the kitchen table now seeming less like historical artifacts and more like pieces of a dangerous, unfinished puzzle. The atmosphere had shifted. They were no longer two strangers with competing interests. They were two people in a besieged house, united by a common enemy. "His threat wasn't idle," Arthur said, his voice low and serious as he locked the back door. "Men like that don't make empty promises. He'll be back, and he'll be better prepared. Whatever is in that bunker, he's willing to do more than just intimidate to get it." Isla nodded, her expression grim. "Then we have to figure out what it is before he returns. He said he knows more than we do. We need to close that gap." And for the next several hours, they worked with a desperate, focused urgency. They pored over every line of John Corrigan's journal, every clause in the partnership agreement, every notation on the old map. Arthur, with his soldier's mind, looked for strategies and warnings. Isla, with her historian's eye, looked for patterns and hidden meanings. Radar lay under the table, a silent observer, his presence a quiet comfort in the tense room. The journal was the key. They knew it had to be. On their first reading, the entries had seemed cryptic but straightforward. Now, with the knowledge of Julian Croft's existence, the words took on a darker shade. John's anxieties seemed less like vague worries and more like the specific fears of a man in over his head. "He was afraid of William Croft," Isla said, tapping a passage from 1962. "Listen. C grows more demanding. He speaks of the project not as a partnership, but as an inheritance. He has a hunger in him that V and I do not share. I fear his ambition will be the ruin of us all." "My grandfather was a strong man," Arthur said, more to himself than to Isla. "It would take a lot to make him afraid." "Maybe it wasn't fear," Isla suggested gently. "Maybe it was caution. Maybe he knew he was in a deal with a shark, and he created some kind of insurance policy." Her words sparked something in Arthur's memory. He picked up the journal and began flipping through the pages again, not reading the entries, but looking at the pages themselves. "When I first read this, I noticed some things in the margins. I thought they were just doodles or calculations." He pointed to a series of entries from the spring of 1963, right around the time the bunker's construction would have been finished. Next to 3 specific paragraphs were small, neatly written numbers. They looked like random notes. 24N8E, 6S1W, 12W5N. "I saw those," Isla said, leaning closer. "I assumed they were references to biblical verses, or maybe some kind of agricultural measurements. They didn't seem to lead anywhere." "They're not verses," Arthur said, his focus sharpening. "In the military, we use coordinates for everything: north, south, east, west." He looked at the first set of numbers. 24 north, 8 east. It looks like a grid reference. Isla grabbed the old map of the property, but the numbers were too large. A grid of that scale would cover half the county. It had to be something smaller, more contained. What if the grid isn't the property? Arthur thought aloud, his mind working through the tactical problem. What if What if the grid is the bunker itself? The idea hung in the air, suddenly making a terrifying amount of sense. It was a small, contained, rectangular space, a perfect grid. They quickly established a theory. The letters had to be directions: north, south, east, west, referring to the walls of the shelter. The first number was a measurement in feet from a corner, and the second number was the distance from the floor. It was a simple, practical code, the kind a man like John Corrigan would create. With mounting excitement, they began to plot the coordinates on a quick sketch of the bunker layout Isla drew on a notepad. "Okay, the first one, 24 north, 8 east," Isla said, her pen hovering over the paper. "The bunker is about 30 feet long on the north-south axis. So, 24 feet from the south corner along the north wall, and 8 feet up from the floor," Arthur finished, his eyes wide. They plotted the second point, 6 feet from the north corner along the south wall, 1 foot up. And the third, 12 feet from the east corner along the west wall, 5 feet up. The 3 points seemed random, scattered across 3 different walls. It didn't make any sense. "It's not a location," Arthur said, frustration creeping into his voice. "It's just 3 random spots on the walls." Isla stared at the sketch, her brow furrowed in concentration. She tapped her pen on the notepad, her mind working. Radar, sensing the tension, got up and rested his chin on Arthur's knee. Arthur absently stroked the dog's head, his gaze fixed on the meaningless dots. "Wait a minute," Isla said suddenly. "Arthur, you said your grandfather was a farmer, but also a builder, right? He built most of this house himself." "Yeah, he was a carpenter by trade before he took over the farm." "A carpenter wouldn't just mark random points," she said, her voice quickening with excitement. "He would measure. What if we've got it backwards? What if it's not 3 separate points? What if it's one location, measured from 3 different reference points, to triangulate its exact position?" It was a leap of logic, but it felt right. They redrew the diagram, this time imagining the points as measurements into a single spot. It was complex, almost 3-dimensional, but as they worked, the lines they drew began to converge. All 3 sets of coordinates, when interpreted as measurements from different corners of the room, pointed to the exact same place. It was a spot on the west wall, a blank, featureless section of concrete, roughly 5 feet from the floor. A spot with no shelves, no fixtures, nothing to distinguish it from any other part of the wall. They looked at each other, the same thought dawning on them both. "There's something in the wall," Arthur said, his voice a low whisper. It was more than a journal. It was more than an old agreement. His grandfather had built a secret inside his secret, a final layer of protection for whatever he was so afraid of. They now knew where to look. The relief of the discovery was immediately tempered by a chilling thought. They had a lead, but Julian Croft was still out there, and he was coming back. The race against time had just begun. There was no time to waste. The discovery of the code had electrified the air, replacing the heavy sense of dread with a sharp, nervous urgency. The knowledge of where to look was a powerful weapon, but Arthur knew it was one with a fleeting advantage. Julian Croft was not a man who would wait long. "We go now," Arthur said, his voice a low command. He pushed back from the table and headed for the door. Isla was right behind him, grabbing a powerful flashlight from her satchel. Arthur stopped at his workshop first, the place of familiar order and logic. He ignored the neat rows of smaller tools and went straight for the back wall, where the heavy equipment was stored. He hefted a 12-pound sledgehammer, its wooden handle smooth and worn from use. The weight felt solid and purposeful in his hands. It was a tool of demolition, and he was about to demolish a wall of silence that had stood for 60 years. He motioned for Radar to follow, and the 3 of them, the soldier, the historian, and the guardian, made their way back to the gaping hole in the garden. The descent into the bunker was different this time. Before, it had been a journey into a mysterious, forgotten space. Now, it was a targeted mission. The cold, stale air no longer felt eerie. It felt charged with secrets, ready to be broken open. Isla shone the flashlight beam on the west wall, while Arthur paced out the measurements from their diagram. The spot their calculations had pinpointed was a blank, featureless expanse of poured concrete, indistinguishable from the rest of the wall. Arthur ran his hand over the surface. It was cold, rough, and perfectly solid. He knocked on it with his knuckles. The sound was a dull, uniform thud. There was no telltale hollowness, no hint of a hidden cavity behind it. A flicker of doubt entered his mind. "It feels solid," he said, his voice flat. "The code was so specific," Isla insisted, though her own voice was laced with uncertainty. "The triangulation was perfect. It has to be here." She pressed her ear to the wall, listening for something, anything. But there was only the dense, unyielding silence of concrete and earth. They stood there for a long, frustrating minute, the solution to their puzzle seemingly within reach, yet completely inaccessible. Had they made a mistake? Had John Corrigan's code been a clever misdirection? It was Radar who broke the stalemate. He had been standing back, watching them with a quiet intensity. Now, he trotted forward, his claws clicking softly on the concrete floor. He bypassed the exact spot they had been examining and began to move slowly along the entire length of the west wall, his nose pressed close to the surface. He moved like a trained professional on a search, his entire being focused on the scents trapped in the porous concrete. He whined softly, a low questioning sound deep in his throat. Then he stopped. He had returned to the very spot their calculations had identified. He pressed his nose hard against the wall, sniffing deeply, his body quivering with concentration. And then he began to scratch. His paws scraped against the rough surface, the sound sharp in the enclosed space. It was not a frantic, panicked scratching, but a determined, insistent act. He knew something was there. Arthur watched him, a wave of absolute certainty washing over him and erasing all doubt. He had seen dogs work before, had trusted his life to their senses in the dusty alleys of Fallujah. A dog's nose could find things that no human, no machine, could ever detect. The summary's intuition became a certainty in his mind. After 60 years, the specially treated, oil-cured leather of a waterproof briefcase, sealed in a dark, airless space, would still emit a faint, residual odor. It would be a ghost of a scent, undetectable to any human, but to a German shepherd with a sense of smell thousands of times more powerful than his own, it might as well be a beacon. "He's found it," Arthur said, his voice filled with a renewed conviction. He rested a hand on Radar's back. "Good boy, that's enough." He handed the flashlight to Isla. "Stand back and hold this steady." He took his position before the wall, the sledgehammer feeling like an extension of his own arms. He planted his feet, his body coiling with the familiar economy of motion of a trained soldier. He took a deep breath, and then he swung. The first blow landed with a deafening crack that reverberated through the small room. A spiderweb of fractures appeared on the surface of the concrete, but the wall held. Dust filled the air. He swung again and again, putting his back, his shoulders, and all his frustration into each impact. It was grueling, punishing work. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his muscles screamed in protest, but he did not stop. He was not just breaking through concrete, he was breaking through the lies that had defined his family's past. With the 10th blow, there was a different sound, a deep, hollow crunch. The head of the hammer punched through, revealing a dark cavity behind the concrete. "It's there!" Isla gasped. Arthur worked for another 10 minutes, widening the hole, pulling away jagged chunks of concrete and rebar with his bare hands until the opening was large enough to reach into. He shone the flashlight inside, revealing a small, neatly constructed compartment, lined with what looked like thick, tar-coated wood. And resting inside was a dark rectangular shape. His heart pounded in his chest. He reached into the rough opening, his hands closing around the object. He pulled it free. It was a briefcase. It was made of a thick, dark brown leather, the kind that was built to last for 100 years. The brass fittings on the corners and the latches were green with tarnish, but they were solid and unbroken. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. It was not just a container for documents. It held something of significant weight. It felt solid, dense with secrets. He carried it over to the desk and set it down in the beam of Isla's flashlight. The dust from their work swirled in the air, dancing like tiny ghosts in the light. Arthur, Isla, and Radar stood there, looking at the briefcase. The search was over. They had found the final piece of the puzzle, the answer his grandfather had buried so deep. Now, all that was left was to face the truth of what was inside. They carried the briefcase up from the bunker and placed it on the solid oak table in Arthur's kitchen. It sat there between them, a dark, silent object that felt heavier than its physical weight. The world outside had returned to its normal, peaceful rhythm. The sun was shining, a gentle breeze rustled the pines, but inside the small house, the air was thick with 60 years of unspoken history. For a long moment, neither of them moved. To open the case was to cross a threshold, to invite a truth into their lives that could never be taken back. Radar, sensing the gravity of the moment, had moved from his spot by the door to lie at Arthur's feet, his body a warm, solid presence against his master's leg. Finally, Arthur reached out. The tarnished brass latches were stiff, and he had to use the tip of a flathead screwdriver from a nearby drawer to pry them open. They sprang free with a pair of dull metallic clicks that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He lifted the heavy lid. The smell that rose from the case was one of perfect preservation. The dry, slightly acidic scent of old paper and the faint chemical tang of acetate from an old reel of tape. The contents were arranged with a meticulous care that spoke of their importance. On top lay a thick manila folder, its contents bound with a simple string. Beneath it, nestled in a cutout in the case's lining, was a 7-inch reel-to-reel audio tape in a plain cardboard box. Isla, the historian, reached for the folder first. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she untied the string and opened it. The documents inside were pristine, the paper yellowed with age but still crisp. She spread them carefully on the table. "My God," she whispered, her eyes wide behind her glasses. They were original, notarized documents from the late 1950s. Stock certificates for companies Arthur had never heard of, deeds to land in other states, and statements from a numbered account at a bank in Zurich, Switzerland. The sums listed were staggering, a fortune far beyond what a few small-town partners could have ever dreamed of. But the most shocking detail was the name printed on every single document. It was not John Corrigan, Elias Vance, or William Croft. The name on everything was Mateo Reyes. "Who is Mateo Reyes?" Arthur asked, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. "I've never seen that name in any of my grandfather's papers," Isla said, her mind clearly racing. "He's not mentioned anywhere, not once. They had found the treasure, but it belonged to a ghost." Their attention turned to the tape. The box was unmarked except for a single, handwritten date on the side, October 1963. "Is there any way to play this?" Isla asked, looking around the rustic kitchen. Arthur's eyes scanned the room, and then he remembered. The radio in the bunker. It's not just a radio. It's an old communications set. Some of them had recording and playback functions. Leaving the documents on the table, they descended once more into the cold concrete room. The heavy radio set on the desk had a built-in reel-to-reel player. It was an old military surplus unit, built to last. Arthur found the power switch, and after a moment's hesitation, a faint orange light glowed to life on the panel. With delicate, careful movements, they threaded the fragile brown tape through the machine's guides. Arthur pressed the play button. A loud hiss and crackle filled the bunker, followed by the slow, rhythmic turning of the reels. For a long, painful moment, that was the only sound. The tape was old, perhaps damaged. Then, through the static, a voice emerged. It was the voice of an old man, thin and reedy, broken by age and something else, a deep, profound regret. Is it working?" the voice rasped. There was a shuffling sound, a cough. "I don't have much time. I have to say this, for my own soul." Isla gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my grandfather, Elias." The voice on the tape continued, often fading into the static, the words broken and disjointed. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were partners. All four of us. John, William, Matteo, and me. Matteo was the brilliant one. He had a mind for numbers, for seeing things no one else could see. The investments, the plans, it was all him. He trusted us. He called us his brothers." The tape hissed for a few seconds, and the voice was gone. Then it returned, clearer this time, and filled with a terrible pain. The greed. It was William. Croft was always greedy. He saw the fortune Matteo had built, and he wanted it all. He said Matteo was an outsider, that he didn't deserve it. He convinced us. John didn't want to do it. He fought it, but he was weak, and God forgive me, I was weaker. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. His grandfather, the strong, honorable man of his memories, being called weak by a confessed conspirator. Elias Vance's recorded voice broke with a sob. The argument in the woods. We told Matteo we had to move the papers, hide them for safety. He believed us. William had a gun. It was so fast. John just stood there. He looked broken, and I did nothing. We took everything, his whole life's work. We buried him where no one would ever find him. We told everyone he'd run off, that he'd taken the money and disappeared. The sound faded again, this time for longer. Arthur and Isla stood frozen, barely breathing. The silence in the bunker was a crushing weight. The voice returned one last time, a faint, desperate whisper through the static. We built our lives on that money, on that sin. But it's a poison. It has poisoned our families for generations. I don't know if this tape will ever be found, but I cannot meet my Maker with this lie on my soul. His name was Matteo Reyes. He was our partner. He was our friend. And we murdered him. The tape ran out. The reel spun freely for a few turns and then stopped. The hiss was gone. The only sound in the bunker was the frantic beating of Arthur's own heart. The truth, in all its brutal, ugly finality, had been spoken. Isla was openly weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face as she covered her mouth with both hands. Her grandfather, the quiet engineer she admired, was a coward and a party to murder. For Arthur, the pain was a cold, sharp blade twisting in his gut. Every memory of his grandfather was now a lie. The house, the land, the quiet legacy he had inherited, it was all the fruit of a poisoned tree. It was a heritage built on betrayal and blood. He had come here to heal from the violence of war, only to find that the very foundations of his home were steeped in a violence far more intimate and vile. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea and disgust. He stumbled back from the desk, his body hitting the cold concrete wall. He slid down to the floor, his head in his hands, the confession echoing in his mind. A wet nose pushed insistently against his arm. He looked up into Radar's concerned, amber eyes. The dog whined softly and began to lick the tears Arthur hadn't realized were falling. In that moment, the dog's simple, honest affection was the only clean thing in the room. Radar couldn't understand the crime, the betrayal, or the lies. He only understood that his master was in pain. He was a creature of pure loyalty in a space that had been defined by the absolute lack of it. Arthur wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in his thick, gray fur. The inheritance wasn't a treasure, it was a curse, and its weight was crushing him. They emerged from the bunker into the bright, indifferent sunlight, leaving the cold and the dust behind. But the chill of the truth clung to them, a shroud of ice that the afternoon warmth could not penetrate. They sat in the kitchen, the terrible evidence spread across the table between them, two souls adrift in the wreckage of their family histories. The silence was absolute, filled with the ghosts of 3 old men and the victim they had created. Arthur stared blankly at the wall, the confession of a dead man echoing in his ears. Isla wept quietly, her face buried in her hands. Radar, ever watchful, moved between them. He nudged Isla's hand with his nose, a soft whine escaping his throat. Then he returned to Arthur's side, resting his great head on his master's thigh, a solid living anchor in a sea of despair. Arthur absently stroked the dog's fur, the simple, repetitive motion, the only thing that kept him grounded. He had seen unspeakable things in the war, had dealt with death and violence. But this felt different. This was a poison that had been running through the veins of his own family, tainting the very soil beneath his feet. A soft knock at the front door made them both jump. It was not the aggressive, demanding rap of a man like Julian Croft, but a gentle, hesitant sound. Radar lifted his head, a low growl starting in his chest. But it was a growl of inquiry, not of immediate threat. Arthur rose slowly, his movements stiff. He looked through the small window beside the door and saw an elderly woman standing on his porch. He didn't recognize her at first, though there was something vaguely familiar about her. He opened the door. She was a small woman, perhaps in her late 70s, with a spine that was still remarkably straight. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant bun, and her dark, intelligent eyes held a deep and abiding sadness that seemed as old as the coastal pines. Her face was a delicate web of wrinkles, a map of a long life that had known both hardship and grace. She was dressed simply in a gray cardigan, dark trousers, and sensible walking shoes. She held a small, woven basket containing a few freshly picked herbs. It was Sophia Reyes, his neighbor from the end of the road, a woman he had only ever waved to from a distance. "Mr. Corrigan," she said, her voice soft but clear, with a strength that belied her age. "Forgive me for intruding. I would not normally bother you, but I have seen things these past few days that have troubled my sleep." Arthur just stared at her, his mind too numb to form a proper greeting. Radar had moved to stand beside him, but he was not growling now. He seemed to sense that this woman was not a threat. Sophia's dark eyes were full of a lifetime of wisdom. "I saw the great oak fall in the storm. It was a sad day. That tree was older than any of us. Then I saw a new car arrive, a woman I did not know. And after that, another car, a black one, driven by men who did not belong here. And I have seen you, Mr. Corrigan, going back and forth from the hole the old tree left behind. I have lived on this land my entire life. I have been watching this property, waiting for a very long time.
waiting for a sign that the ground was finally ready to give up its dead. Her words, so strange and poetic, sent a shiver down Arthur's spine. He didn't know what to say. "My name is Sophia Reyes," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "My grandfather's name was Mateo Reyes." The name struck the air with the force of a physical blow. Arthur felt his knees go weak. He stepped back, pushing the door open wider in a silent invitation. Sophia walked past him and into the kitchen. Her eyes fell upon the briefcase and the scattered documents on the table, and a look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow passed over her face. It was not the shock of discovery, but the pain of confirmation. She looked at Arthur and then at Isla, her expression softening with a sad empathy. "So you know," she whispered. Isla, her face streaked with tears, could only nod. Sophia pulled out one of the simple wooden chairs and sat down at the table, as if she belonged there. She looked not at the documents, but at Arthur. "I will not ask you to imagine what it is like," she began, her voice gaining strength, "to grow up with a name that has been disgraced. The official story was that my grandfather, Mateo, was a thief, that he stole a great deal of money from his partners, your grandfathers, and fled, abandoning his wife and child. My mother—" She paused, her gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "He was not a thief. He was a brilliant man. He came to this country from Spain with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind that could see patterns in the world that no one else could. He was an immigrant who believed in the American dream. He worked, he saved, he invested. He saw potential where others saw only farmland and pine trees. He created a fortune, and he trusted his partners. He called them his brothers, his proof that this new country had accepted him." She picked up one of the old stock certificates, her fingers tracing the name. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale told to children about a dishonest foreigner. Her story filled the room, transforming the crime from a dry confession on a tape into a living, breathing tragedy. It gave a face, a life, and a family to the name Mateo Reyes. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had been loved, a man whose legacy had been stolen and twisted into something ugly. Arthur looked at the evidence on his table, but listening to Sophia, he realized there was one last fight he had to face. This was not about a disputed inheritance or a dark family secret anymore. This was about a debt of honor. His grandfather, John Corrigan, had made a choice 60 years ago. He had chosen weakness, chosen to be a bystander to a terrible crime. The discovery of the truth did not bring relief, only a heavy, cold clarity. The shock and grief that had paralyzed Arthur in the bunker began to recede, replaced by the grim, familiar focus of a soldier with a mission. He was no longer a man adrift in the past. He was a protector with a duty to perform. The objective was clear: protect Sophia, protect the evidence, and see that justice, 60 years delayed, was finally served. "He'll be back," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating with a newfound authority that made both Isla and Sophia look at him. "Croft isn't the type to give up. He'll come back, and he'll be ready for a fight. We have to be ready for him." His military training, long dormant, took over. He began to think in terms of strategy and tactics. "The cell service here is unreliable at best. I need to make a call, but I can't do it from the house. There's a ridge about a mile up the road where the signal is clear." He looked at the two women, their faces pale and frightened in the fading afternoon light. "Lock all the doors behind me. Don't open them for anyone. Radar will stay with you." The dog, sensing the shift in his master's tone, stood and positioned himself between Arthur and the women, a silent, furry sentinel already on duty. Arthur drove his old truck with a controlled speed, his eyes scanning the road.
He found the spot on the ridge, and the small signal bars appeared on his phone. He dialed a number he knew by heart. "Carter," a gruff voice answered on the second ring. "Ben, it's Art Corrigan," Arthur said, getting straight to the point. "Art, it's been a while. Everything all right out there in the woods?" Sheriff Ben Carter was a broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, a man Arthur had served with in the Marines before they had both returned home to Maine to seek out quieter lives. They didn't speak often, but the bond they shared was unbreakable. "Not exactly," Arthur said. "I'm in some trouble, Ben. A man named Julian Croft. It's a long story, no time to explain now, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to come to my place, but you have to time it right. What do you need?" Carter's voice had lost its casual tone, replaced by the sharp focus of a lawman. "I need you and a couple of your deputies to be at the end of my lane in exactly 2 hours from now," Arthur said, checking his watch. "Don't come up to the house. Just wait there. If I don't call you back within 2 hours to tell you it's a false alarm, I need you to come in, and come in ready. Can you do that for me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You got it, Art. 2 hours." "Thanks, Ben." Arthur hung up. The clock was now ticking. When he got back to the house, he went straight to the kitchen table. "We need to secure this," he said, gesturing to the briefcase. "Croft will head straight for the bunker. That's the first place he'll look." Working together, they carefully placed the documents and the tape back inside the waterproof case, the objects now feeling like a sacred trust. Arthur then took the briefcase and carried it not to the bunker, but to the small pantry off the kitchen. He lifted a loose floorboard beneath a shelf of canned goods, a hiding spot his grandfather had probably used for stashing liquor, and placed the briefcase inside, covering it again. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy them time. His last preparation was to walk to the tall, locked cabinet in his study. He unlocked it and pulled out his shotgun. It was a simple pump-action Mossberg, a tool he used for hunting, not for fighting men. The cold, heavy steel felt familiar in his hands. He checked the chamber, loading it with shells of birdshot. They were designed to stop a threat, not to be lethal. He was a soldier, not a murderer, and he would not let Croft drag him down to that level. The 2 hours that followed were the longest of Arthur's life. They sat in the living room, the sun sinking below the horizon, plunging the house into a tense twilight. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside, made them jump. Radar lay at Arthur's feet, utterly still, his ears twitching at every sound. A perfect, living alarm system. Just as Arthur's watch showed they had 10 minutes left, Radar stood up, a low growl starting deep in his chest. A few seconds later, they all heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the living room windows. He was back. Arthur took a deep breath. "Stay here, both of you," he said. And with the shotgun held low, he walked to the front door. This time, there were 4 men, including Croft. They were carrying heavy flashlights and pry bars. The pretense of civility was gone. "The games are over, Corrigan," Croft snarled, his face a mask of ugly greed. "Give me the briefcase." "It's not here," Arthur said calmly. "Liar," Croft spat. "You found it in the bunker. That's where it belongs. We're going to get it. You can either walk with us, or my men can carry you." Arthur knew a fight on the porch was a losing battle. He had to get them to the right place. "Fine," he said, lowering the shotgun slightly. "It's in the bunker. We'll all go." They marched him out into the darkness, with Isla and Sophia being herded behind him. The air was cold and damp. Croft's men shoved him down the concrete steps into the dark shelter, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. "Find it," Croft ordered, and his men began to search, kicking over the old desk, tearing the shelves from the walls. "It's not here," one of the men shouted after a few minutes of fruitless searching. Croft turned on Arthur, his face contorted with rage. "Where is it?" As he stepped forward, one of his men moved to grab Isla's arm. That was the line. "Get back," Arthur yelled, raising the shotgun to his shoulder. But he didn't aim at Croft or at any of the men. He aimed at the back wall of the bunker, the rough, earthen section of the original root cellar that had been integrated into the new construction. He pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The roar of the shotgun blast was magnified tenfold, a physical blow of sound and pressure. A huge cloud of dust and dirt erupted from the wall where the birdshot hit. The men cried out in shock, stumbling back, their ears ringing, momentarily blinded by the muzzle flash. They were stunned, disoriented. In that single, chaotic moment of hesitation, Radar attacked. He had been a coiled spring of silent fury at Arthur's side. Now, he launched himself through the dust-filled air. He did not go for Croft. He went for the henchman closest to the stairs, the one blocking their only exit. With the efficient, controlled power of a predator, he hit the man's leg, his powerful jaws clamping down. The man screamed, a cry of pain and terror, and went down hard, his flashlight skittering across the floor. The scene was a tableau of sudden chaos. One man was on the ground, a snarling German shepherd standing over him. Another was still blinking, trying to clear his head. Croft and his remaining man were frozen, staring at the shotgun now leveled directly at them. And then, above the ringing in their ears, they heard it. A faint sound from the outside world, growing rapidly louder. The unmistakable wail of police sirens. Julian Croft's face, illuminated by the wavering flashlight beams, was a picture of disbelief turning to pure, impotent rage. He had been so close. He had held all the power, and he had been outmaneuvered by a reclusive soldier and his dog. Moments later, the bunker was flooded with the bright, strobing red and blue lights of patrol cars. Sheriff Ben Carter appeared at the top of the stairs, his service weapon drawn. "Drop it, Croft!" he yelled. It was over. Arthur lowered the shotgun, the adrenaline suddenly draining from his body, leaving him weak and trembling. He watched as Croft and his men were handcuffed and led away into the night. Justice, delivered by a man, a woman, and a dog, had finally arrived on this haunted piece of land. He knelt and wrapped his arms around Radar's thick neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. The silent battle was finally won. The flashing lights of the patrol cars painted the dark woods in strobing shades of red and blue, a chaotic and violent pulse in the heart of the quiet night. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a strange calm descended. Julian Croft and his men were led away in handcuffs, their arrogant threats reduced to sullen, impotent silence. Sheriff Ben Carter took their statements, his expression a mixture of professional calm and personal concern for his old friend. Sophia and Isla, wrapped in blankets Arthur had brought from the house, told their parts of the story, their voices shaky but clear. Through it all, Arthur felt a profound sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from someone else's life. He answered Ben's questions with the clipped precision of a soldier giving a report. He felt the reassuring weight of Radar leaning against his leg, the dog's steady presence the one thing that felt truly real. The battle was over. The violence had passed. Now, all that remained was the wreckage. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. Lawyers were hired, statements were given, and the contents of the briefcase were entered into evidence. The story of the 60-year-old crime became a matter of public record, a local sensation that was written about in newspapers across the state. The names of Corrigan, Vance, and Croft were once again linked, not in partnership, but in a shared, shameful history. For Isla, the process was a painful but necessary epilogue to her research. She had sought historical truth and had found it in its rawest, most brutal form. She worked tirelessly with the lawyers, her methodical mind ensuring that every document was authenticated, every part of her grandfather's confession corroborated. For Arthur, it was a duty. He attended every meeting, signed every paper, and did everything that was asked of him. He was a witness to a crime committed by his own blood, and he would not shirk the responsibility that came with that knowledge. The final step took place on a bright, cold morning in a lawyer's office in town. Arthur, Isla, and Sophia sat together at a long, polished conference table. A lawyer in a sharp suit laid out the final documents. They were legal instruments of renunciation, papers that would formally sever any claim Arthur and Isla had to the assets of Mateo Reyes and transfer them in their entirety to his sole living heir, Sophia. Isla signed first, her signature a quick, decisive stroke of the pen. She looked up, a sad smile on her face. "My grandfather helped take this from your family," she said to Sophia. "It is the least I can do to give it back." Then it was Arthur's turn. He picked up the pen and looked at the papers, at the long list of stocks and properties that represented a life of unimaginable wealth. He thought of the house, the land, the quiet life he had sought. Then he thought of the pained, regretful voice on the tape and the quiet dignity in Sophia's eyes. He signed his name without a moment's hesitation. It did not feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a cleansing. Sophia, her hands trembling slightly, accepted the documents. Tears welled in her dark eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "You have given my family back more than just money," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have given us back our name, our honor. There is no way I can ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," Arthur said simply. "We just righted a wrong." With the legalities settled, Arthur was left alone once more on the land that was, for a little while longer, still his. But the peace he had once found there was gone. The silence was no longer calming. It was accusing. Every creak of the old house sounded like a whisper of betrayal. The wind in the pines seemed to murmur the name of the man his grandfather had helped kill. The very soil felt tainted. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not build a future on a foundation of blood and lies. A few days later, he made another call, this time to a statewide nature conservancy. He told them he had a property, a large plot of coastal woodland and a bluff overlooking the sea, that he wanted to sell. He asked for only a fraction of its market value, with one condition: that the land would never be developed, that it would be allowed to remain wild and free, a quiet sanctuary for the trees and the sea, a place to heal. His last week in Maine was spent packing. He sold most of the old furniture, keeping only what would fit in the back of his truck: his clothes, his tools, a few books, and the military ammo box containing his grandfather's journal. It was a part of his history he could not leave behind. He said his goodbyes. Isla was heading back to her university, her next project already taking shape. They shook hands, a bond of mutual respect forged in the crucible of the past few weeks. "If you ever find a place to settle, let me know," she said. He nodded, though both of them knew he didn't know where he was going. His farewell with Sophia was harder. She came to the house and gave him a small wrapped parcel. "For your journey," she said. It was a loaf of freshly baked bread, a simple, neighborly gift that was filled with a world of gratitude. "Be safe, Arthur Corrigan. You are a good man, like I always believed your grandfather should have been." On the final morning, the house was empty. The rooms echoed with his footsteps. He took one last walk through the garden with Radar. He stopped at the pit where the great oak had once stood. It had been filled in with fresh soil, a smooth brown scar on the green lawn. It was there that his journey into the past had begun. Now, his journey into the future was about to start. He knelt and wrapped his arms around his dog. "Well, boy," he whispered into Radar's thick fur, "it's just you and me again." Radar licked his face, his tail thumping a steady, reassuring rhythm against the ground. His loyalty was the one inheritance that had not been a lie. Arthur climbed into the driver's seat of his old pickup truck. Radar jumped in beside him, settling into the passenger seat as if he had been born there. Arthur started the engine, the familiar rumble a comforting sound. He put the truck in gear and pulled away, not looking back at the empty house on the bluff. He drove down the gravel lane for the last time, past the spot where Sophia Reyes stood on her porch, raising a hand in a silent farewell. He turned onto the coastal highway, heading west, with no destination in mind. He had no house, no land, no fortune. He had lost the physical legacy of his family. But as the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a brilliant golden light across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had lost a past built on shame, but he had reclaimed his honor. He had lost a tainted inheritance, but he had found his own soul. And beside him, his most loyal friend in the world looked ahead, ready for the new day and the new path to begin. Sometimes the heaviest secrets are the ones we inherit, and the most valuable legacy is not land or fortune, but the quiet honor we choose for ourselves. The purest treasures are often found not in a hidden vault, but in the unwavering loyalty of a companion like Radar, who guides us toward a new dawn. If this story of honor and companionship touched your heart, we would be truly grateful if you shared it with others and left your thoughts in the comments below. To ensure you never miss a new journey, please subscribe and join our community. Another tale is ready to begin, and you can find it waiting for you right now on the screen.